The albatross files remind Singapore of something uncomfortable, that some of our most important decisions were not made in moments of confidence, but in moments of quiet fear. Independence does not mean no dependence. It means discovering which dependency are the most dangerous, and deciding which one must be cut first. In the first episode, we talked about water. Today, we talk about a greater threat. Water threatens survival slowly. It buys time, sometimes years, to respond. But this threat did not arrive with headlines. One man understood this danger early, Dr. Goh Keng Swee. He was not afraid of independence. He was afraid of what would happen. He understood a brutal truth. A country short of water dies slowly. A country short of money can die overnight. This was the problem. After separation in 1965, Singapore did not have its own currency. What people used every day, what wages were paid in, what savings were held in, was the Malayan Dollar. It was a strangling rope around a young, vulnerable nation. Monetary decisions made elsewhere can trigger inflation here. Loss of confidence could drain capital overnight, and Singapore, small, open, dependent on trade, would have no lever to pull. The founding leaders understood the danger. Singapore could not afford an economic model restrained by another country's priorities. Independence meant nothing if economic survival was still outsourced. The question was never whether Singapore wanted its own currency. It was whether Singapore could afford the risks of creating one. History offered little comfort. New currencies fail more often than they succeed. Some collapse through inflation, others lose trust or never recover. In places like Zimbabwe or Argentina, confidence evaporated quickly. In parts of Southeast Asia during the late 1990s, currencies unraveled almost overnight. But some survived, not through luck, but restraint. Countries like Taiwan held tight control. South Korea endured painful reforms. Hong Kong locked itself into rules it could not easily break. The lesson was clear. Currencies do not fail because they are new. They fail when governments treat them as tools of convenience. Singapore understood that. In 1967, Singapore introduced its own currency. There was no celebration, there was caution. Business hesitated, traders watched closely, ordinary people wondered whether their savings would hold their value. This was Singapore's driving on its own for the first time, with no spare tire. Any loss of confidence would have triggered capital flight, and the comparison with the ringgit was constant, quiet, and unforgiving. Singapore did not try to convince people with promises. It convinced them with behavior. Budgets were kept tight, reserves were built patiently, financial rules were enforced even when they hurt. There was no attempt to impress markets, only to reassure them. Over time, the restraint sent a signal. This currency will not be sacrificed for short-term relief. The real judgment came during crisis. In the Asian financial crisis, currencies around Singapore collapsed as confidence vanished. The Singapore dollar did not. During the global financial crisis, fear dominated market worldwide. The Singapore dollar held not because it was exciting, but because it was predictable. Even during the COVID period, when governments elsewhere stretched their finances, the Singapore dollar was increasingly seen as a defensive, low-volatility currency in Asia. Each crisis reinforced the same message: discipline will not be abandoned when it was needed most. Over time, the Singapore dollar and the ringgit drift apart, not through competition, but through consequence. Different economic structures led to different choices. Different choices compounded into different outcomes. The Singapore dollar benefited from the predictability and the institutional trust, but it also carries its own risks. High costs, global exposure, and a dependence on external stability. Stability demands constant effort. It is not guaranteed. Today, the Singapore dollar is not a symbol of power. It is a symbol of restraint. It represents decades of choosing credibility over convenience and accepting that economic independence must be paid for continuously. Water was one cost of separation, money was another. But neither matters without protection. Independence only works if it can be defended, and that leads to the next, and perhaps most unforgiving cost of separation, security.